G'day and welcome to Season 3 of Harvestable by AgriDigital. Join co-founders Emma Weston and Ben Reed in this 8-part mini-series as they delve into the transformative power of data in agribusiness, exploring AI's impact, supply chain transparency, and the future of data-driven grain management. In this episode, we're thrilled to be joined by Joel Robbie, Head of Sales and Growth at Trace.
Well, hi everybody and welcome back to Harvestable. I can't believe we're already halfway through Season 3 and we've got a cracker today because I'm joined by Joel Robbie, who leads industry engagement at Trace, which is a carbon management platform. And Joel's going to explain what Trace does, but we're going to really be delving into the way carbon and data are interconnected. So Joel's had a really interesting background. I'll actually open it up to him to talk a little bit about that, just so that you can get to know who he is. So welcome, Joel, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Emma. It's really nice to be here and nice to be talking to you again. So I've had a bit of a journey over the last few years. I like to call myself a recovering founder at the moment. So
still recovering.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's been a few years now. I probably need to stop using that term, but yeah, it does feel like I'm still recovering at times. Sold my business, which was a software business in the financial services space a few years ago, and I've really been helping other startups build their first growth functions since then. And very pleased to now be working at Trace, which is a carbon management platform, as you said, and to be working on climate, which is a real passion of mine. So I'm very happy that I've found my way to Trace.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think so interesting to have this conversation today. Like we had planned this a while ago, right? So we'd caught up again and I was like, we're doing data and AI. This is such a good fit to think about it in terms of, what Trace does and also what your role at Trace is. But you actually have a broader interest in ag tech and climate anyway. And so thinking about, just how this relates to our audience and our customer base, I think is going to be really interesting. But I wanted to kick off with some pretty basic terminology stuff, actually, just to get that out of the way, because I do think there's still some confusion, which is, probably, understandable around things like what is an offset, what is an inset, and even just what do we mean by a carbon footprint. Are you able to just kind of take us through that before we even get into what the role of data is?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think maybe starting with the carbon footprint itself is probably the best way to frame this up before we dive into things like offsets and insets. So the carbon footprint of a business is basically how much carbon does a business emit from its activities in a given period. And typically we measure a carbon footprint on an annual basis. So the carbon footprint of a business is usually expressed in tons of carbon for a year is usually what you'll see people talking about on the web and on their websites and things. Trace's role is basically to measure that carbon and help businesses create a plan to reduce it over time. That's the role that we play in the space. So that's what a carbon footprint is. And then there's kind of aspects to carbon management like insetting and offsetting, which I can go into next if you like.
Yeah, I think just really good to have that basic understanding of what when we see something on a website or we see a claim around this is how much we emit, or this is what our carbon footprint is, just understanding what that means. So that's just a nice basic one. I guess that is something probably that's going to become de rigueur, right, for most businesses, government departments, if it's not already in many, but it's coming, right?
Absolutely, and I think you'll see lots of publicly listed companies already voluntarily disclosing their carbon. I think we're going to talk a bit about the mandatory climate risk and carbon disclosure regulation that's coming next year, and I'll talk a bit about as well a bit later how those sorts of market mechanisms that government is introducing will actually end up impacting smaller and medium businesses as well, because it is very much a downward force that does tend to wrap up a bunch of small and mid-sized businesses as well. It's definitely coming, and our view is that in 3 to 4 years' time, disclosing and measuring your carbon emissions is going to be as common as doing your financials at the end of every year.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should just continue on with carbon footprints for a moment before we get to offsets and insets, just so we,
For sure.
don't confuse everybody, or at least don't confuse me anyway. So just thinking about, so there's a lot of data that has to be collated and I guess transformed in some way to go into establishing a carbon footprint. Can you just talk us through, is that right to begin with? Is there a lot of data? Where does this data come from, and how is it verified or audited, so that we can actually trust that carbon footprint information?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's two main data sets that go into creating a carbon footprint. One is data from the operations of a business. So this is things like how many kilowatts of electricity does that business use every year? How much do they spend on their supply chain, and in what categories do they spend that money? How many kilometers do they travel every year? How do their employees get to work? How many kilograms of waste do they generate? So lots of different metrics from a business, but typically metrics that most businesses will have to hand. Kilowatts of electricity is typically in an electricity account somewhere. Spend is typically in an accounting system somewhere. For farmers that'll be listeners of this program, it's in a farm management system, or often connected to an accounting system as well, in terms of how many liters of fertilizer did we buy, how many liters of diesel did we chew through this year. All those sorts of metrics are really important for calculating the carbon footprint. So that's one data set, the inputs from a business and the activity of a business. The other data set is what we call emissions factors, and this is basically research that's been done by academic institutions and the United Nations and governments that have gone out there and said and done studies on how many kilograms of carbon get emitted per unit of business activity. So, for example, how many kilograms of carbon get emitted per kilowatt of electricity that gets used. And so there's a factor for pretty much any business activity you care to name, or any supplier that you care to name. And the very high level math is business activity multiplied by emissions factors equals carbon footprint. So we take a type of business activity or some business data, we multiply it by the appropriate emissions factor for that activity, and then we get the carbon quantified at the end of that.
Yeah. Okay. And then basically all of that's added up, and then that becomes the footprint. Yep. Okay.
That's right. Yep.
Yep. And so the verification process, largely it is taking information that already exists somewhere, and of course, I guess rubbish in, rubbish out, right, is still the rule. So there's some elements of trust in there, I suppose, but there'll also be a lot of data that probably exists within systems like, whether it's a platform like Trace or elsewhere, to be able to kind of say, well, that's a bit unusual, that looks a bit underreported or a bit overreported, I presume. So, as you kind of get this complexion of, so many different companies in different use cases, reporting on emissions and on footprints, I guess you get to start to size up industries.
Absolutely. And I think there's, in the same way that we audit our financial accounts every year, and where companies are required to be transparent about their financial accounts and truthful about their financial accounts every year, the same is true of your carbon accounts or your carbon footprint. So transparency and truthfulness is a really important principle in the carbon space. So being transparent about what business data have you included as your inputs, and what data did you choose to exclude or did you not have to hand, and then being really transparent about that wherever you're disclosing your carbon footprint, so that people can say, oh yeah, cool, these guys have measured their carbon footprint, but they didn't have that data to hand, but they've told us that. So at least they're being transparent about the fact that maybe their carbon footprint isn't 100% complete, and they're taking steps to gather that data for next time. So transparency and being transparent about the methodology and what were the inputs to a carbon footprint is a really important principle in this space. And from an audit and verification perspective, I think having a third party verify the methodology that was used and document any exclusions or gaps in the input data is really good practice as well. So, for our customers, we play that third party verifying role as well through our sustainability team that we have in house, and we also see a really significant role for financial accountants in playing that verification role. Going forward, particularly for smaller businesses, we think there's a really amazing opportunity actually for accountants to start to build carbon accounting businesses within their accounting practices.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that because I think there'll be quite a lot of crossover for some of our customers at AgriDigital, and just within the podcast audience as well, thinking about who they might be leaning on, to them with this, navigate this space. So let's go back to insets and offsets, because I'm really interested in that. And I might be overstating things, so you're going to put me on the right track here. But when I think about who we deal with at AgriDigital and who we build technology for, it's a very broad spectrum across the supply chain. And so I'm kind of betting that there's going to be some of our customers who would be able to, us sequestering carbon, for example, and would be able to potentially use that sequestration into the carbon, introduce that sequestration into the carbon economy at some point. And then there'll be others who, are really going to struggle to get to net zero positions just by their own actions. And so we're going to have to look at how they, participate in buying, carbon, offsets at some point, right? To help them. So could you just kind of demystify some of this, with a little bit of thought towards the agricultural and grain supply chain, I guess, if you can, but just why are there offsets and insets, and does that equate to winners and losers, I guess?
Yeah, so certainly not. Our view is certainly that there's a place for both in every business operation, and whether you're a farm or whether you're a management consulting business in the city. Yeah, so talking about a farm example, I think would be really helpful here. And I think a farm's a really interesting business to talk about offsetting and insetting, because you can kind of have it's one of those businesses where you can have both in kind of quite interesting ways. So a farm, a cropping operation might apply some maybe a seed coating to their seeds at planting time to increase soil organic carbon in the soil. They might apply some biochar to the soil as part of the annual cropping operation. Both of those things are going to increase the amount of carbon sequestered in the soil. And there's two things that the farm could do with that. It could keep that carbon sequestration inset, so it could say that that's reducing the carbon, the net carbon output of the operation overall, and keep that in house. It could maybe generate some carbon credits or some offsets from that additional sequestration, and sell that on the carbon markets as a carbon credit. So a farm is quite interesting because it can do both. And so an example of a farm operation having quite a broad involvement in the carbon ecosystem or the carbon value chain would be, a farm might inset and change their practices by having electric vehicles on the farm for the first time and reduce some of their carbon footprint that way. They might sequester some additional carbon in the soil by changing some of their practices, and they might sell some of those as carbon credits on the carbon market and actually be a provider of carbon offsets to someone else. And equally, a farm might buy carbon offsets from someone else as well. So, for example, one of our projects that we support from an offsets perspective is a traditional land management in Northern Australia, and so a farm might purchase some of those offsets as well, instead of, or as well as increasing the amount of soil carbon and the amount of carbon that they're sequestering within their own operation. So a farm can participate in the carbon market and in the carbon value chain in lots of different ways. So they're quite interesting businesses from that perspective.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and it's to try and work out, to speaking from my own perspective as a farmer, to try and work out what strategy, or it's hard to pick a winner. Sometimes it's trying to do a few things at once, and then this is where I think the importance of really good record keeping, and then being able to, turn those records into, leverageable insights, which obviously help us make decisions, down the track is kind of what we're trying to do on our farm. And, that's everything from, yes, we would like to go EV. We haven't done electric vehicles as yet, but that's definitely a plan. Part of the plan, though, was to put solar in first, and, to create a small solar farm, with some storage, which, then gives us the capacity to obviously, use that to power other machinery on farm, but also then looking at our farming practices and our land use, so a lot of what you said really resonates for me, and I'm sure it does for many of our listeners as well. So I mean, we would love to chat forever, but we obviously cannot. And we're actually recording this on a Friday afternoon, so I'm standing between you and the end of the day. But one thing I did want to just think about in terms of the way data and carbon are interacting is around, there's a lot of talk in the news around mandatory climate or carbon reporting, and you alluded to a little bit of that earlier. How is data kind of fueling that reporting economy, and what is the connection that you might be seeing with natural systems accounting models?
Yeah, I think this is a really good example of how data has a role to play in the carbon space. And I think the clearest example I can give is the federal government has released the mandatory carbon disclosure requirements for 2024 and beyond, which is basically a phased rollout of mandatory requirements for companies to disclose the carbon footprint. It's larger businesses like Coles and Woolies first next year, next year, and then it sort of gets progressively smaller, and then FY 27-28 is basically anyone with over 100 employees and over $25 million in assets, which is going to be a lot of the farms listening to this. But I think it's really important to talk about the first wave of that mandatory reporting. So I gave the Coles and Woolies example, and Coles as a business has said they've actually been reporting voluntarily their carbon footprint for a few years now, and this year they said that they are going to require 75% of their supply chain to report their carbon emissions on an annual basis, which is a big deal, and it's an example of how mandatory reporting actually drives a requirement for carbon data in the supply chain. So Coles is going to go to a lot of the farms that are probably listening to this and say, we need to know what your carbon footprint is, because we want better data on how much carbon is in our supply chain.
You're really talking about like a data domino effect here, right?
Absolutely.
That's what we're going to see. And so even if this is not something that is core to our business at this point, or maybe even not something we're interested in, it's just probably going to be something we're going to have to do, right? Because in order to participate, particularly in commodity supply chains, and maybe it might be a little bit different for some of the more niche supply chains, but I would say they're already ahead anyway, most of those niche supply chains. But it's just going to become, a ubiquitous and universal, participation piece, right?
Absolutely, and I think one of we see our role in this space as being able to help businesses large and small to see around some of these corners, and you don't know you need to start collecting carbon data until someone asks you for some. And what I can tell everyone who's listening to this is that if you're in any way connected to the Coles and Woolworths and the supermarket supply chain, you are about to get asked for it very, very soon. And so it is one of those things that it's worth preparing for. It's worth having a plan in place. It's worth being able to communicate not just your carbon data, but also what your plan is in terms of reduction. And so we've talked about insetting and offsetting, and having a plan to manage your carbon, not just a plan to disclose your carbon, is going to become more and more important when it comes to actually growing the revenue you get from some of those larger customers like Coles and Woolies.
Well, I know that, and I know we need to bring it to an end, but I know that there are already customers who have come to us at AgriDigital and have told us a couple of really interesting things. One is that they're getting pressured to be disclosing grain miles. So, this is kind of how far grain might have travelled, through the supply chain, and therefore, what are the attendant emissions and the carbon footprint of, that travel piece. So certainly we've already had some customers, wanting to understand how they can use AgriDigital to support, that reporting requirement that's coming their way. So another really interesting one was one of the larger corporate farms who's a customer of AgriDigital, telling us that carbon is everyone's business. So, they don't have anyone who is particularly, head of carbon per se, because it's just got to be part and parcel of, the way they do business, which is really, really interesting. Well, Joel, I need to let you get to the weekend. I want to thank you so much for sharing what Trace is doing, some of the insights that you're seeing as this carbon economy starts taking off, helping us, definitionally, and also understanding that data, it's not just about the disclosure, it's actually about management as well. I think that's a really important insight. So thanks, Joel, and we'll talk again soon.
Really nice to be here, Emma. Thanks for having me, and see you soon.
Thank you for tuning in to Harvestable by AgriDigital. We hope you found value in today's conversation. Join us next week as we delve deeper into the world of agribusiness and data. Until then, stay curious and keep harvesting insights.